The first time I heard about the boy in the glass house, people said he had not spoken in almost a year. They said he had not taken a single step since the night his mother died, and they said his father had enough money to buy every doctor in Boston, but still could not buy back the sound of his own child laughing. Now I did not know any of that when I first walked through those iron gates. With my cheap coat button wrong and my hands smelling like dish soap, I only knew the rent was late. My little sister needed school supplies. My mother was pretending her chest pain was just heartburn again. And a woman like me did not get the luxury of turning down work just because the house looked too rich to breathe in. My name was Clara Mae Turner back then, 26 years old, born and raised on the south side of Providence, Rhode Island, in a neighborhood where the sidewalks cracked before the people did, where folks learned to laugh at bad luck because crying took too much energy, and where every mother on the block had at least one robe she wore like armor when she came outside to yell at somebody's kid. I grew up in a two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that smelled like bleach, old coins, and wet winter coats, and I used to tell myself I was not going to stay there forever, not because I hated it, but because I loved my family too much to let that be the best we ever saw. My father, Clarence Turner, drove delivery trucks and sang Motown off-key while fixing whatever broke in our place, which was pretty much everything, and he had this way of talking that made hardship sound temporary, like poverty was just a bad storm passing over the roof. He would tap the kitchen table with 2 fingers and say, "Clara Mae, don't ever let a fancy room make you forget who you are, because marble is just rock with better lighting." I laughed at that when I was younger, but after he died, I held on to that sentence like a prayer. His heart gave out on a rainy Tuesday morning behind the wheel of a delivery van, and just like that, the man who made our little apartment feel bigger than the world was gone, leaving behind a stack of bills, a mother whose health got worse every month, and my baby sister Leela, who was 14 and still believed if she studied hard enough she could escape the kind of life that eats girls whole before they even know what they want. I dropped out of community college with 1 semester left. Not because I wanted to, not because I lacked ambition, but because ambition does not keep the lights on when the utility company sends that pink notice, and grief does not care if you had plans. I cleaned hotel bathrooms near the airport, worked breakfast shifts at a diner where businessmen called me sweetheart, without looking at my face, babysat twins who bit each other for sport, and once spent 3 weeks sorting donations at a church basement, where a woman told me I had leadership potential, while handing me a trash bag full of socks. I said thank you because I had manners, but inside I was tired, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and makes every mirror feel like it is accusing you. Then one evening, Mrs. Churzo, Delaney from the apartment downstairs, stopped me in the hallway while I was carrying 2 grocery bags and a busted umbrella, and she said, "Clara, I know a family in Boston looking for live-in help, private housekeeper, some childcare too, very good money. But I have to be honest with you, it is not a normal situation." I remember laughing a little, because normal had not paid me once in my life, and I asked her what she meant. She lowered her voice like the walls might gossip, and told me about the Whitmore family of Beacon Hill, old money, real estate money, museum donation money, the kind of money that gets its name engraved on hospital wings. She said the mother had died the year before in an accident. The little boy had not spoken since, had not walked, barely responded to anyone, and the father, Mr. Adrian Whitmore, was difficult. Difficult is a funny word when rich people use it. It can mean grieving, cruel, lonely, rude, or all 4 wearing a tailored coat. Mrs. Delaney must have seen the worry on my face because she put her hand on my arm and said, "I would not send you if I thought you could not handle it, Clara. You have a soft heart, but you also have a backbone, and that house needs both." I wanted to tell her soft hearts do not survive houses like that, but my phone buzzed right then with a message from my mother asking if I could pick up her prescription on the way home, and that was the end of my hesitation. The next morning, I took the commuter rail into Boston with my best blouse under a wool coat that had lost 2 buttons, my hair pinned back neat, my resume tucked in a folder from an old tax office, and a sandwich wrapped in foil because I did not know if rich people let staff eat. The train slid past gray neighborhoods and frozen lots, then into streets that got cleaner the closer we came to money, and I watched the world change through the glass, corner stores turning into cafes with tiny chairs outside, chain link fences turning into black iron gates, people walking dogs that looked better groomed than most of the men I had dated. By the time I reached Beacon Hill, I felt like I had wandered onto a movie set where everyone else had the script. The Whitmore house sat at the end of a private lane behind a high brick wall covered in ivy. Not a mansion exactly, but something colder, sharper, A modern glass and limestone home built behind an old historic facade, as if someone had taken a grandmother's brownstone and hollowed out its heart, then filled it with mirrors. A security camera followed me up the walk, slow and silent, and I almost turned around right there, not because I was scared of cameras, but because I suddenly understood I was about to step into a place where every breath would be measured. The door opened before I knocked. A woman in her 70s stood there, small but upright, with silver hair cut to her chin, and eyes that looked like they had survived things money could not fix. She wore a navy cardigan, pearl earrings, and house slippers, which made me like her immediately. "You must be Clara Turner," she said, and her voice was warm enough to make the whole entryway seem less expensive. "I am Eleanor Whitmore, Adrian's mother, and please, before you start being nervous, know this house has already intimidated enough people for one lifetime." That made me smile, just a little. She noticed, and her own smile deepened, like she was relieved I still had a shimmer. "Come in, child," she said, and I stepped onto a floor so polished I could see the tired version of myself staring back. The foyer rose 3 stories high with a glass ceiling that poured cold morning light over everything. Pale stone walls, a floating staircase, a black grand piano no one seemed to play, and one single vase of white lilies on a table so smooth it looked offended by fingerprints. There were no family shoes by the door, no school paper stuck to the fridge, no framed vacation pictures cluttering shelves, no crooked magnets, no signs of ordinary life making a mess and refusing to apologize. It was beautiful, sure, but beautiful in the way a showroom is beautiful, a place designed for people to admire without touching. I thought about my father's marble joke and almost heard him whisper, "Rock with better lighting, baby." Mrs. Purse White Whitmore led me down a hallway where my footsteps sounded too loud, and she explained the basics softly: housekeeping, laundry, light cooking, and helping with her grandson Jonah, who was 6, although she said his name like it hurt. His therapist come 3 times a week, she told me, but lately Adrian has been canceling sessions if Jonah gets upset. He thinks structure will protect the boy. She paused outside a set of tall doors. Sometimes grief makes intelligent people very foolish. Before I could answer, another voice cut through the hall behind us. "Mother, I thought we agreed not to discuss family matters with applicants." I turned and saw Adrian Whitmore for the first time, and I understood right away why half the staff in Boston probably lasted 1 week. He was tall, early 40s, dressed in a charcoal suit even though it was Saturday morning, with dark blonde hair combed back and a face so controlled it barely seemed alive. Not ugly, not at all. Actually the kind of handsome that made magazine photographers' axe deep, but his eyes were the problem. They were blue, cold, watchful, and tired in a way he clearly did not want anyone to notice. He looked at me like I was a stain that had walked in carrying references. "Clara Turner," he said, not asking. "Yes, sir," I said, and I hated how quickly the "sir" came out, like my mouth had accepted the hierarchy before my spine did. His gaze moved from my coat to my shoes, to the folder in my hands, then back to my face. "Mrs. Delaney speaks highly of you." "Mrs. Delaney speaks highly of most people who return her casserole dishes," I said before I could stop myself. Mrs. Whitmore made a tiny sound that might have been a cough or a laugh. Adrian did not smile. I felt my stomach drop, but honestly, part of me was glad I had said it, because if I was going to lose the job in the first 30 seconds, at least I would go out as myself. He studied me for another moment, then said, "This house requires discretion, precision, and emotional boundaries. My son does not need pity, he does not need experiments, and he certainly does not need someone turning his condition into a personal mission." The words were calm, but they landed like small slaps. I kept my voice even and said, "I am here to work, Mr. Whitmore, not to perform miracles." "Good," he said, "because miracles are usually excuses for poor planning." Now that was the first thing he said that almost made me feel sorry for him, because only a man who had begged for a miracle and not received one could hate the word that much. Mrs. Whitmore stepped in before the air turned completely to ice and suggested I meet Jonah. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he gave one short nod and moved aside. The playroom was at the back of the house, overlooking a small garden boxed in by brick walls, and if you judged by the furniture alone, you would think it belonged to the luckiest child in New England. There were shelves of wooden puzzles, art supplies arranged by color, picture books in perfect rows, a train set polished and waiting, stuffed animals seated like a jury along the window bench, and a therapy mat in the corner that looked barely used. But the room had no sound, no crayons rolling underfoot, no toy cars abandoned after a crash, no little kid chaos, none of that warm evidence that a child had passed through like a tiny tornado. Jonah Whitmore sat near the window in a small gray chair, knees tucked close, one hand wrapped around the ear of a stuffed fox so worn it looked like it had been loved in another life. His hair was light brown, soft and messy, his skin pale, his eyes fixed on the bare branches outside. He did not look at us when we came in. He did not blink much either. The stillness around him was not peaceful. It was defensive, like his whole body had decided that if he stayed quiet enough, the world might stop hurting him. Mrs. Whitmore's voice lowered. "Jonah, sweetheart, this is Clara. She may be staying with us for a while." Nothing. Not even a flicker. Adrian stood behind me near the door, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but I could feel him watching me near the door. Arms crossed, his face unreadable, but I could feel him watching me watch his son. That was the first choice I made in that house, and I think it mattered more than I knew at the time. I stayed by the bookshelf, gave him space, and said quietly, "Hi, Jonah. I am Clara, and I am not going to ask you any questions today because honestly, people ask too many questions before lunch." Mrs. Whitmore glanced at me, surprised. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Jonah still did not look at me, but his fingers moved once on the fox's ear. It was almost nothing, but in that room, almost nothing felt like thunder. I noticed a little stack of animal books on the shelf and picked one up. Not the shiny new one on top, but a bent paperback with a dog on the cover. Because children like things that look as if they have survived being held. I sat on the floor, not too close, opened the book, and began reading in the calmest voice I had. I did not try to be magical. I did not do funny voices. I did not lean in and ask if he liked dogs. I just read, because sometimes the kindest thing you can give a frightened child is a voice that does not demand anything back. After 3 pages, Adrian spoke from the doorway. "That is enough." His voice did not rise, but the room tightened around it. I closed the book slowly. Jonah's hand clenched the fox. I stood up, feeling heat climb my neck. Not anger exactly, not yet, but the first little spark of it. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore," I said. He looked at me like he knew I had swallowed something I wanted to say. "Good," he replied. "We follow his care plan here. We do not improvise." That word improvise came out like a crime. I nodded because I needed the job, because my mother's prescription was sitting in my purse with a receipt I could not afford, because my sister had texted me a picture of a college brochure like hope was still something we could casually keep on the fridge. But as I left that room, I made myself one private promise, not dramatic, not heroic, just quiet and stubborn. I would not let that boy's silence become furniture in that house. The first week was exactly what you would expect if a museum hired a tired woman to dust its ghosts. I woke before sunrise in the little staff room off the laundry hall, folded linens so crisp they could probably cut bread, polished surfaces that already shined, learned which mugs Adrian used and which ones were apparently decorative, which seemed ridiculous to me, because a mug with no coffee in it is just a ceramic lie. Mrs. Can ridiculous to me. Whitmore treated me kindly, slipping me extra toast in the mornings, asking after my mother without making me feel poor for answering. But Adrian ran that home like a courtroom, where I was always halfway to being found guilty. If a towel hung unevenly, he noticed. If Jonah's apples were sliced too thick, he noticed. If I opened the curtains wider because the room felt dim, he noticed and closed them halfway again. One morning, he stood in the kitchen doorway while I packed Jonah's lunch tray and said, "The blueberries need to be rinsed longer." I looked down at the blueberries, which had already been washed like they were going into surgery, and said, "Any longer and I am going to have to name them." Mrs. Whitmore turned her face toward the window, shoulders trembling. Adrian's mouth barely moved, but I saw it, the smallest almost smile, gone so fast he probably denied it to himself. Then his eyes hardened again. "Humor will not help my son, Miss Turner." "Maybe not," I said softly, "but it has helped a lot of people survive their fathers." I regretted it immediately, not because it was untrue, but because the air changed. Adrian stepped closer, not threatening exactly, but controlled in that rich man way that says other people are used to moving when he enters a room. "My father has nothing to do with this," he said. I held his gaze, my heart kicking. "Neither does mine, but I still bring him into every room I enter." For 1 second, something raw passed through his face. A crack in the ice. Then he turned away and said, "Keep to the schedule." That was Adrian. Every time a human moment tried to happen, he shut it down like a window in a storm. And Jonah watched all of it. He watched from the edge of rooms, from behind doorways, from inside that terrible quiet. And I began to understand that the boy had not only lost his voice, he had learned that sound made adults dangerous. The second week I saw what fear had done to him. I was changing his bed sheets while he sat on the rug with his fox, and the corner of the sheet snapped by accident. Not loud, just a quick crack of fabric, but Jonah flinched so hard he knocked over a wooden block tower beside him. The blocks scattered. His eyes went wide, his small hands flying up over his head. I froze. Every instinct in me wanted to rush over, scoop him up, tell him he was safe, but I knew better, not from a textbook, from life. Fear hates sudden kindness almost as much as sudden anger. So I lowered myself slowly to the floor, several feet away, and whispered, "That scared me too, buddy." That sheet came in way too confident. He did not laugh, not then, but his breathing slowed. I picked up one block, set it upright, then pushed it over with one finger and said, "Well, that was rude of it." Still nothing, but he peeked at me. Just a peek. It lasted maybe half a second, but I carried that half second around all day like a winning lottery ticket. That evening, Adrian found one wooden block still under the chair and held it up between two fingers as if it were evidence in a murder trial. "Toys are to be put away after structured activity," he said. I wanted to tell him Jonah had looked at me, that his son had peeked out from behind the wall for half a second, that sometimes healing leaves a little mess under the furniture, but Adrian was not listening for good news. He was scanning for danger. I took the block and said, "I missed it. It will not happen again." "See that it does not," he said. Then Jonah made a sound. Not a word, not even close, just a small breathy noise from across the room. But both of us turned. His eyes were on the block in my hand. I held it out gently, not moving closer. "Do you want this one, sweetheart?" Adrian snapped. "Do not pressure him." The sound vanished from Jonah's face like a candle blown out. My hand lowered. Adrian saw it too, and for a moment I thought maybe he would understand what he had just done. Instead, he said, "He is overstimulated," and walked out. That night, I called my mother from the staff room and told her only the easy parts, because when you love sick people, you learn to edit your suffering. I told her the house was big. The grandmother was kind. The kitchen had a refrigerator that looked smarter than me. I did not tell her the father made me feel like a mistake in his hallway, or that the little boy's silence followed me to sleep. Mama listened, then said, "Clara May, some homes are full of money and still starving. You be careful where you give your heart." I said I knew. I did not know. Not really. By the end of the third week, I had learned Jonah's language. Not words, but tiny weather changes. If his thumb rubbed the fox ear fast, he was anxious. If he's turned toward the window, he was finished with people. If he pressed his lips tight, sound was trying to come out and losing the fight. I learned he liked warm light better than bright light. Liked the smell of cinnamon, disliked the piano even though no one played it, and calmed when rain tapped against the glass. I also learned Adrian's schedule better than I wanted to, because the man appeared whenever Jonah and I came close to anything real. If I read too softly, he asked why I was whispering. If I used a cheerful voice, he said I was overstimulating the child. If I placed crayons on the table, he reminded me Jonah had not shown interest in drawing since the accident. The accident, that was what they called it. Nobody said much more, not at first. Only that Adrian's wife, Meredith, had died on an icy road outside Concord, and Jonah had been in the car, strapped in the back seat, too young to understand, old enough to remember the sound. Once, while carrying folded towels past Adrian's study, I heard him on the phone with the doctor. His voice low and furious. "No, I will not authorize another exposure exercise. The last one left him shaking for 2 hours. I do not care what the research says. I am his father. I decide what he can handle." There it was, the thing underneath all his cruelty, not pride, not just arrogance, but terror dressed up as authority. He was not controlling the house because he thought it made him powerful. He was controlling it because the one night he had not been able to control anything had destroyed him. Knowing that did not make his behavior acceptable, but it made it human, and human things are harder to hate cleanly. Still, compassion has limits when someone keeps using grief like a weapon. The day everything shifted started with oatmeal. That sounds ridiculous, I know. But life-changing moments almost never announce themselves with violins. Sometimes they arrive with a bowl of breakfast and a 6-year-old who refuses to open his mouth. Jonah had been having a bad morning, shoulders tight, eyes down, the fox tucked under his arm like a shield. Adrian stood nearby checking messages, tense because a therapist was due at 10, and he had already decided the day would go badly. I set the oatmeal in front of Jonah, plain, approved, boring enough to qualify for a mortgage, then placed 3 blueberries on top in the shape of a tiny crooked face. It was nothing. A silly little face, one blueberry eye slightly lower than the other, which honestly made it relatable. Jonah stared at it, his fingers loosened on the fox, and then his mouth twitched. Not a smile, not fully, but the beginning of one. Adrian looked up. "What is that?" he asked. "Breakfast," I said. "That is not on the plan. It is 3 blueberries, Mr. Whitmore. Arranged unnecessarily. Most joy is." His eyes flashed. "Remove it." Mrs. Whitmore, sitting at the far end of the table, said quietly, "Adrian." He ignored her. "Miss Turner," I said, "remove it." Jonah's hand moved toward the bowl. "Just 1 inch, maybe less." I did not move toward the bowl. "Just 1 inch, maybe less." I did not move. Adrian did. He reached for the bowl and Jonah recoiled so hard the spoon clattered to the floor. The sound cracked through the room. Jonah covered his ears, face going white. Adrian froze with the bowl in his hand. I stepped between them before I thought better of it. "Put it down," I said. The room went silent. Adrian's eyes lifted to mine, and there it was. All the class difference, all the power, the job I needed, the paycheck my family depended on, the invisible line I had been warned not to cross. "Excuse me," he said. My voice shook, but I did not back up. "Put the bowl down? You were scaring him?" His face hardened. "You were out of line." "Maybe," I said, and God help me. Once I started, I could not stop. "But that boy is not a schedule. He is not a broken antique you keep behind glass. He is your son, and every time he reaches for something, you snatch the world away before he can touch it." Mrs. Whitmore whispered my name, not as a warning, more like a prayer. Adrian stepped closer, furious now, but the fury was cracked around the edges. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. 3 weeks, and you think you understand my child better than I do?" "No," I said, softer now, "but I think I am less afraid of him being alive." That hit him. I saw it. The words struck some hidden place he had boarded up and painted over. His hand tightened around the bowl, then slowly lowered it back to the table. Jonah was still trembling. I crouched several feet away and slid the fallen spoon across the floor toward him like it was a little boat. No demands, no instructions, just a spoon arriving gently. Jonah stared at it for a long moment, then looked at the oatmeal, then at me. His lips parted. Adrian stopped breathing. Mrs. Whitmore's hand went to her mouth, and Jonah, with a voice so small it barely belonged to the room, whispered one broken sound. "Blue." Not blueberry, not breakfast, just blue. But it was a word, his first word in almost a year. For 1 second, nobody moved, because when a miracle comes quietly, people are scared to touch it. Then Adrian took 1 step forward, and Jonah flinched. That flinch destroyed the moment. Adrian saw it. Really saw it. This time, his own son afraid of him. Not the room, not the spoon, not the spoon, not the past. Him. His face changed in a way I had not seen before. He looked younger suddenly, and lost, like a man who had spent a year guarding a locked door, only to realize he had been standing on the wrong side of it. I wanted to comfort him, which annoyed me because I was still angry. But before anyone could speak, Jonah reached one tiny hand toward the bowl, touched the crooked blueberry face, and made a soft sound that might have become a laugh if the room had not been holding its breath. Adrian set his phone down slowly. His voice came out rough. "Leave us." I looked at Jonah. The little hand went back to the fox. Mrs. Whitmore stood. "Adrian, do not." He turned on her, but the anger was already collapsing into panic. I said, "Leave us." I knew that tone. It was the sound of a man about to choose control. Because vulnerability had embarrassed him, I should have stayed quiet. I know that. A smarter woman would have protected the job, protected the paycheck, protected the fragile little place she had carved out in that cold house. But sometimes your mouth becomes the only honest thing left in you. I said, "If I leave right now, he will think speaking was the mistake." Adrian's eyes snapped back to me. "And if you stay, you will forget you are an employee." There it was. Not just anger, not just fear, but the reminder of where I stood. The help. The outsider. The woman who could be dismissed before lunch and replaced by dinner. My cheeks burned. Mrs. Whitmore looked heartbroken. Jonah looked down at the fox. I swallowed every sharp thing I wanted to say and gave Adrian the only truth I could afford. "You can fire me if you need to, Mr. Whitmore, but do not punish him for reaching." Then I walked out before my courage had time to run away from me. I made it to the laundry hall before my knees started shaking. I pressed my hands against the dryer, felt the warmth buzzing under my palms, and tried not to cry because crying in rich people's laundry rooms felt too on the nose. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Mrs. Whitmore came in, closed the door, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she handed me a clean handkerchief, actual cloth, monogrammed, because of course it was, and said, "My son has been drowning for a long time, Clara, but today you made him feel the water." I laughed through my nose, wiping my eyes. "That sounds like a fancy way of saying I am unemployed." She smiled sadly. "Not yet. But you should know, in this family, truth is usually treated like bad manners. I asked her what happened the night Meredith died. She looked at the closed door, then back at me. Adrian was driving behind them in a separate car. He saw the crash happen. By the time he reached them, Meredith was gone and Jonah was silent. Since then, Adrian has mistaken fear for love. Her voice broke on that last word, and I, foolish old woman that I am, have let him. For the first time, I understood the house completely. The glass walls, the perfect floors, the untouched toys, the rules about food and light and sound. They were not signs of order, they were symptoms. That house was not protecting Jonah from grief. It was preserving the exact temperature of the day. Everything died, and somewhere upstairs, a little boy had just said blue, while his father stood in the wreckage of what that word meant. I did not know then whether Adrian would fire me, apologize, or build the walls higher by morning. I only knew one thing for sure. The silence in that house had cracked, and once silence cracks, even a man like Adrian Whitmore cannot pretend he does not hear it. The strange thing about a child speaking after nearly a year of silence is that everybody wants to celebrate, but nobody knows how to move without breaking the moment. And in the Whitmore house, where even Joy had to ask permission before entering a room, Jonah's tiny word hung in the air for the rest of that day, like a bird trapped against the glass. I stayed in the laundry hall longer than I needed to, folding the same stack of towels twice because my hands needed something to do. Because if I walked back upstairs too soon, I might say something reckless again, and reckless women with sick mothers and little sisters do not get to pretend there are no consequences. Mrs. Whitmore left me there after a while, but before she went, she touched my shoulder and said, "Whatever happens next, Clara, do not mistake his fear for your failure." That was a kind thing to say, but kindness does not stop your stomach from twisting when the man who signs your paycheck has just looked at you like you dragged a match across his gasoline. Around noon, Adrian's assistant came by, a sharp young man named Bennett who wore a headset in one ear and carried a tablet like it contained the 10 Commandments. And he told me Mr. Whitmore would not require my services for Jonah's afternoon routine. Require my services, that is what he said, like I was a catering tray. I nodded because Bennett was not the villain here. He was just one of those people who had learned to survive powerful men by becoming furniture with Wi-Fi. For the rest of the afternoon, I cleaned bathrooms that did not need cleaning, wiped counters that had never known crumbs, and listened for Jonah. Once, from the hallway, I heard Adrian speaking low in the playroom. Not angry, just strained, and then nothing. Not a cry, not a word, not even the soft thud of blocks. Silence came back fast in that house like it had keys. That evening, Mrs. Whitmore insisted I sit in the kitchen with her while she drank tea, and I pretended not to be starving. She pushed a plate toward me with half a chicken sandwich on it and said, "Eat before pride kills you." I told her I was not proud, just employed. She said, "In my experience, those two are often at war." I ate the sandwich. It tasted better than dignity. A few minutes later, Adrian walked in, sleeves rolled up, tie gone, hair less perfect than usual, which somehow made him look more dangerous because grief looks different when it takes off its jacket. He stopped when he saw me at the table. I stood too quickly, bumping my knee, and Mrs. Whitmore sighed like the whole room had disappointed her. "Sit down, Clara," she said. Adrian's eyes moved to his mother. "This is a family kitchen." She lifted one eyebrow. "Then perhaps you should try acting like family in it." That one landed. Adrian looked away. I should have enjoyed it, but I was too tired. He turned to me and said, "Jonah will resume his regular care plan tomorrow. No blueberry faces, no unscheduled reading, no emotional improvisations." The word improvisations again, like joy had been smuggled across state lines. I set the napkin beside my plate and said, "He spoke today." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I am aware." "Are you?" His eyes snapped to mine. Mrs. Whitmore set down her teacup very slowly. I knew I should stop, but something in me could not let that word blue be buried under another schedule. I said, "Because you are talking about tomorrow like today did not happen." He stepped closer to the table. "Today happened because my son was overwhelmed." "Today happened because your son wanted a blueberry," I said. And I know that sounds small to you, but for him it was not small. It was a choice. His first one in months, maybe longer. Adrian laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "You think I do not want my son to choose?" "I want him alive, Miss Turner. I want him safe." "Safe from what?" I asked. "Fruit? A spoon? Me?" His face changed. Mrs. Whitmore whispered, "Clara," but I was already in it now, and the words came out, "or safe from the possibility that if he starts living again, you will have to feel everything you have been keeping locked up with him." The silence after that was terrible. Adrian looked at me as if I had slapped him, and maybe I had, just with something worse than a hand. For a second I saw the man under the control, the ruined husband, the terrified father, the person who had been standing at the crash site for a year, even while his body went to board meetings and charity luncheons and pediatric consults. Then he disappeared again. "You will not speak to me that way in my house," he said. "No," I said, my voice shaking now. "I probably will not, because I am guessing I will not be in your house much longer." Mrs. Whitmore stood. "Adrian, do not be a fool." He turned to her, and the anger in his face cracked into something uglier, something desperate. "You keep acting as if love can fix this, Mother. Love did not pull Meredith out of that car. Love did not make Jonah answer when I called his name. Love does not stop the nightmares. It does not restore nerve pathways. It does not undo trauma. It does not do trauma. It does not undo trauma. It does not do anything except make people believe they are safe right before the world proves they are not." His voice broke on that last word. Not much, just enough. Enough to make the kitchen feel less like a battlefield and more like a hospital room after bad news. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes filled, but she did not soften. "Then what is control fixed, Adrian?" she asked. Show me. Show me what your perfect rules have healed." He looked toward the hallway, toward where Jonah's room waited in silence. He had no answer. I wish I could tell you that was the moment he changed, that his pride fell apart right there beside the sink, and he apologized to everybody like a man in a movie who finally hears the music swell. But real people are more stubborn than that, especially men who have built their whole personality out of not falling apart. Adrian told me I could finish the week, then he would make other arrangements. Just like that. Finish the week. Other arrangements. My life reduced to a polite firing wrapped in expensive language. I nodded because my throat had closed up, and I left the kitchen before either of them could see my face. In my little room, I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at my phone. I needed to call Mama. I needed to tell her I had lost the best-paying job I had ever had, because I could not keep my mouth shut over 3 blueberries. But I could not do it. I could not hand her that fear while she was already carrying so over 3 blueberries. But I could not do it, so I texted Lila instead. "You studying?" She answered, "Trying. Algebra is disrespectful." I laughed, then cried, then laughed again, because life really will have you weeping into a pillow while your sister insults algebra like it owes her money. I told her to keep going. She sent back, "You too." 2 words. Nothing fancy. But they held me together. The next morning I came upstairs expecting frost. Maybe a termination letter printed on paper thick enough to build a wall, but the house felt different. Not warmer exactly, but unsettled. Bennett was not there. The therapists had been canceled. Mrs. Whitmore was in the dining room pretending to read, which I had learned meant she was waiting for someone to stop being an idiot. Adrian was nowhere to be seen. Jonah sat in the playroom by the window, Fox in his lap, eyes on the garden, and the bowl of oatmeal on the table beside him was plain, approved, joyless. I stood at the doorway, not going in. "Good morning, Jonah," I said softly. That was all right. I did not expect lightning to strike twice. But then his fingers moved, rubbing the fox's ear, and his eyes slid toward the table, toward the empty top of the oatmeal. My heart squeezed. I looked down the hall. No Adrian, no Bennett, just the quiet house holding its breath. I walked to the kitchen, took 3 blueberries from the bowl in the refrigerator, and came back. I placed them on a small saucer near the door. Not on his food, not too close, not a demand, just an invitation sitting politely in the room. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the bookcase and began reading the dog book again. After 2 pages, Jonah looked at the saucer. After 4 pages, he reached for 1 blueberry and held it between his fingers like it was a tiny planet. After 6 pages, he set it on the oatmeal himself. Not a face, just 1 blue dot in all that beige. And from somewhere behind me, Adrian said, "I thought I was clear." I closed the book. Jonah's hand froze. I turned slowly. Adrian stood in the doorway, unshaven, wearing a sweater instead of a suit, which should have made him look softer but did not because his face was carved from a sleepless night. I said, "He did that." Adrian's eyes moved to the single blueberry on the oatmeal. He looked at Jonah, then back at me. "You provided it." "I did. He chose it." His mouth tightened. "You are very skilled at making disobedience sound noble. And you are very skilled at making fear sound like policy," I said. His eyes flashed, but then Jonah made a small noise. Both of us stopped. The boy's gaze was fixed on the blueberry. His lips moved. Nothing came out. Adrian took 1 instinctive step forward, and Jonah's shoulders tightened. I raised a hand, not at Jonah, at Adrian. Wait, the audacity of me, honestly. A housekeeper holding up one hand to a millionaire in his own playroom like he was a dog about to jump on company. Adrian looked furious, but he stopped. Jonah breathed, shallow and fast. I said, "It is okay, sweetheart, no hurry. Blue can stay blue without you saying it." His eyes flicked to me, then he whispered, "Boo." It was not blue this time, not clearly, but it was sound. It's Mibri. Then he whispered, "Boo." It was not blue this time, not clearly, but it was sound, intentional sound. My eyes burned. Adrian did not move. Is fit? I smiled at Jonah, small and steady. "That is right, Boo. Honestly, same. Sometimes blueberries are spooky before breakfast." And then, so quick I almost missed it, Jonah's mouth twitched. Adrian saw it. I know he did. His whole body changed, not softened exactly, but paused, as if some part of him had reached for anger and found confusion instead. He backed out of the doorway without a word. I did not know whether that was good or bad. In that house, retreat could mean mercy or a storm gathering. Over the next few days, Adrian did not fire me. He did something worse in a way. He watched. He watched me from doorways, from the kitchen, from behind the glass wall of his study. And no matter how ordinary the moment was, he looked at it like he was trying to solve a language he had refused to learn. I kept everything small. No grand gestures, no sudden hugs, no inspirational nonsense, just tiny choices, a blue cup and a white cup, and Jonah could look at the one he wanted. 2 books placed side by side and he could touch a cover, a soft yellow scarf draped over one chair, a green blanket over another, and if he moved his eyes toward one, that counted. Adrian questioned every step at first. Why offer choices if he cannot answer? Because he is answering, I said. You just keep waiting for English. That annoyed him enough to leave the room. But he came back. Always. One afternoon, I brought in a sock puppet because I had discovered Jonah liked ridiculous things as long as they did not come too close. The puppet was made from one of my own socks, clean, I should clarify, because even in a dramatic life story, hygiene matters. I gave it 2 button eyes and a crooked yarn mouth, and I named him Senator Waffles, mostly because I thought a child in Beacon Hill deserved at least one friend with a dumb name. Mrs. Biss' name. Whitmore laughed so hard when I showed her that she had to sit down. Adrian said, "That is absurd." I said, "Thank you, that was the design brief." Jonah watched from his chair, expression blank, but his thumb slowed on the fox's ear. I kept Senator Waffles at a distance and made him complain about household policies. "Good morning, citizens," the puppet said in my worst official voice. "I hereby declare oatmeal suspicious and socks underrepresented in government. Mrs. Birdman." Whitmore pressed a hand over her mouth. Adrian stood stiff near the piano, clearly suffering. Jonah stared. Then Senator Waffles tried to climb a block tower, gave a grand speech about courage, and immediately fell over backward. The sound that came out of Jonah was not quite a laugh, but it had laughter's shadow in it. I did not look at Adrian. I knew better than to spook the miracle by checking if the skeptic had seen it. But I heard him inhale. Later in the hallway, he stopped me. "Miss Turner." I turned, bracing myself. He looked uncomfortable, which I had learned was his version of humble. "The puppet," he said, and then stopped as if the sentence embarrassed him. "Yes, it was not in the care plan." "No." Jonah responded to it. "He did." Adrian looked away toward the playroom. "Why?" I almost gave him a careful answer about trauma, control, predictability, low-pressure engagement, all the things I had read late at night on my phone while half asleep. But the truth was simpler. "Because the puppet does not need him to be fixed," I said. "It just falls down and gets back up looking stupid." Adrian blinked. That may have been the first time I saw him truly listen. Not agree, not yet, but listen. The days that followed became a strange kind of truce. Adrian still had rules, more rules than a tax office, but some of them loosened around the edges. He let me sit with Jonah longer. He stopped correcting every small choice before Jonah could make it. He still hovered, but sometimes from farther away, which in that house counted as a breakthrough. Jonah began making more sounds, mostly breathy starts of words. "Buh" for blue, for fox. One heartbreaking little "ma" one morning when Mrs. Whitmore walked in wearing the perfume Meredith used to wear, and the whole room went still because we all heard who he was reaching for. Adrian left then, not angrily, he just walked out. I found him 10 minutes later in the side hallway near the coat closet. One hand against the wall, head bowed. I should have kept walking. I did not. "Are you okay?" I asked. He gave a laugh so bitter it barely counted. "Do I look okay?" "No," I said. "But people rarely ask when the answer is obvious." He wiped a hand over his face, then straightened like he had remembered who he was supposed to be. "I do not need your pity." "Good, because I am low on pity today. I have empathy, irritation, and about half a granola bar in my pocket." Choose wisely. He stared at me, and then, unbelievably, he laughed once, not much, one breath, but real. The kind of laugh that escapes before grief can check the locks. He looked almost offended by it. I pretended not to notice because sometimes dignity is just looking away at the right time. He said quietly, Meredith used to make voices for his stuffed animals. Bad voices. Terrible, actually. Jonah loved them. His eyes stayed on the floor. After she died, I put them all away for months. I thought they were hurting him. Maybe they were hurting you, I said. His jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. I waited, he said. When Jonah said blue, I wanted to be happy. I did. But all I felt was panic. If he starts coming back, then I have to admit he was gone. That sentence broke something in me. Not sympathy exactly, something sadder and more human. Adrian Whitmore, with all his money, all his power, all his control, was afraid of hope because hope makes you vulnerable twice. Once when you reach for it, and again when you imagine losing it. I said, my father died with the delivery route half finished. For months I hated every truck I saw, like the whole city was rubbing it in. Then one day I smelled diesel and started crying outside a grocery store. A stranger asked if I was okay, and I said yes because I was embarrassed. But the truth was, grief had been driving me around for so long I forgot I was allowed to get out. Adrian looked at me then, really looked. Not as staff, not as an inconvenience, but as a person carrying her own wreckage. What did you do? He asked. I bought the groceries, I said. Then I went home and made my mother's soup too salty. He gave me a puzzled look. That helped? No, it was awful. But we ate it anyway, and my sister made fun of me. And for 20 minutes, grief had to sit at the table with us instead of on top of us. That is what you do. You let life be in the room, even when grief is there too. He did not answer. But the next morning, something changed. I came into the kitchen and found Adrian standing at the counter with 2 bowls of oatmeal, 3 blueberries beside one of them, and an expression like a man defusing a bomb. He did not look at me. How many blueberries constitute unnecessary arrangement? He asked. I leaned against the doorway. Depends. Are you attempting joy or committing fruit vandalism? His mouth twitched. I am attempting not to terrify my son before breakfast. That was the closest thing to a confession I had ever heard from him. I stepped beside him, leaving enough space so he would not feel cornered by kindness, and showed him how to set the blueberries near the rim. Not a full face this time, just a little crescent, something Jonah could choose to complete. When Adrian carried the bowl in, his hands were steady but his shoulders were not. Jonah looked at the bowl, then at his father. Adrian knelt, not too close, and said, I made part of it. You can finish it if you want. His voice was awkward, gentle in a way that did not fit him yet, like shoes not broken in. Jonah stared for a long time. Then he picked up 1 blueberry and placed it above the crescent. A crooked smiley face. Mrs. Whitmore cried into her napkin. I suddenly became very interested in the coffee machine. Adrian lowered his head, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. Jonah whispered, boo. Adrian swallowed hard. Yes, he said, almost laughing, blue. That was the beginning of the house thawing. Not all at once, not in a pretty montage, but in messy little moments nobody would have cared about from the outside. Adrian learned to sit on the floor without checking his watch every 30 seconds. He learned that Jonah hated being rushed but liked being invited. He learned that silence was not always refusal. Sometimes it was a child gathering courage grain by grain. He still made mistakes. Lord, did he make mistakes? One afternoon, he clapped too loudly when Jonah stacked 5 blocks, and Jonah startled so badly Senator Waffles had to hold an emergency congressional hearing about excessive enthusiasm. Adrian apologized to a sock that day. I wish I had taken a picture. Another morning, he tried to read a story and used the flattest voice I had ever heard from a living man, and Jonah slowly turned toward me as if asking for rescue. I told Adrian, with respect, Mr. Muntz, Whitmore, that bear sounds like he is reading an insurance policy. Mrs. Whitmore laughed until she wheezed. Adrian sighed, then tried again and somehow made the bear sound like a bored lawyer, which was not better but at least showed effort. Jonah's smiles came more often after that. Small ones, cautious ones, but real. He began touching objects again, choosing socks, pushing toy cars, tapping the fox's nose against Senator Waffles when he wanted me to make the puppet fall over. His legs were still weak from disuse and trauma, and movement frightened him. But one day during therapy, with Adrian watching from the doorway and me sitting on the mat, Jonah leaned forward to reach a red ball. His hand missed, his body tipped, and before anyone could panic, he caught himself with both palms. The therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Patel, went very still, which is how you know professionals are excited. She said softly, "That is good, Jonah. No pressure. Just good." Adrian's hands curled at his sides. I could feel him wanting to rush in, wanting to protect, wanting to control the air between his son and disappointment. But he stayed back. He stayed back like it cost him everything. Jonah looked at the ball again. I rolled it a little closer with one finger. Not enough to make it easy, just enough to make it possible. Come on, Senator Wapples whispered from my lap. Democracy depends on this ball. Jonah made a tiny sound, then he reached again and touched it. Not grabbed, not played, just touched. Adrian turned away fast, but not before I saw his face. He was crying, quietly, privately, the way men cry when they have spent too long believing tears are evidence against them. That night, he knocked on my staff room door. I had been writing down expenses in a notebook, trying to figure out how to stretch my paycheck across rent, medication, groceries, and Lila's school trip, which was a math problem even algebra would call disrespectful. I opened the door expecting some household instruction, but Adrian stood there holding an envelope. My first thought was severance. My second thought was I should have stolen more of that fancy tea. He said, "May I come in?" I almost laughed because no rich man had ever asked permission to enter a room I occupied, but I stepped aside. He looked around the tiny space, the narrow bed, the little desk, my mother's prescription bag, the photo of my father taped to the mirror. Something in his face shifted. "This is inadequate," he said. I said, "It is bigger than my closet at home, so do not insult it in front of me." He nodded once, accepting a correction. Then he held out the envelope. "I owe you back pay." I blinked. "For what?" "For the work I prevented you from doing properly." That sounded so Adrian I almost smiled. Inside was a check larger than I expected. Too large. I looked up. "This is not back pay." "It is partly that, and partly an apology I do not know how to say yet." I handed it back, "Then say it badly." He looked almost pained. "Clara." "No," I said. "Money is useful, trust me. I am a big fan of it, but if you use it to avoid words, you are just putting a bow on the same old problem." He stared at the envelope, then folded it once in his hands. For a long time he said nothing. Then, quietly, "I am sorry." Not polished, not grand, barely above a whisper, but real. I waited. He continued, "I treated you like an intruder because you were doing what I could not. You reached him without forcing him. You made him feel safe in a house I built to protect him." He swallowed, "And I think I built it wrong. There are moments when someone says the thing you needed to hear, and instead of feeling victorious, you just feel tired." I sat on the edge of the bed. Adrian remained standing until I pointed at the chair. He sat like the chair might invoice him. I told him about my mother then, more than I had meant to, about her chest pain, the bills, Lila, the way responsibility can turn you into a person who does not recognize her own reflection. He listened without interrupting, which was new for him. Then he told me about Meredith. Not the polite version, not the obituary version, but the real one. She had been a photographer, messy, always leaving coffee cups where they did not belong, the opposite of Adrian almost every way. Jonah had been in the car with her the night black ice sent them into a guardrail. Adrian had been following behind after a charity event, close enough to see the taillight spin, too far to stop it. He said when he pulled Jonah from the back seat, the boy was awake but silent, staring through him, and Adrian kept saying, "Look at me, buddy, look at me." But Jonah would not. Meredith died before the ambulance reached the hospital. After that, Adrian said every object in the house became evidence of what he had failed to prevent. Toys on the floor meant danger. Noise meant danger. Change meant danger. Love meant danger most of all. I sat with that. "There are some stories you do not interrupt, because interrupting would be a kind of theft." When he finished, he looked at the floor and said, "I do not know how to be his father without being afraid." I said, "You do it afraid. That is what the rest of us do." He gave a broken little laugh. "Is that your professional advice?" "No," I said. "That is my broke daughter, big sister, former waitress, current housekeeper advice. Very exclusive." He smiled then, not big, not easy, but enough to make him look like a man Meredith might have loved. After that night, the Whitmore house did not become perfect. Thank God, because perfect was what had nearly killed it. It became imperfect in all the right places. There were crayons on the breakfast table, a half-built block tower by the sofa, therapy bands hanging from a chair, one of Mrs. Whitmore's cardigans mysteriously claimed as a blanket fort wall, and Senator Waffles, who had somehow become a respected household member despite having no qualifications and questionable stitching. Adrian started coming home earlier. Sometimes he sat with Jonah and said nothing, which was often better than anything he could have said. Sometimes he asked me questions, real questions. Does he like the garden better in the morning or afternoon? Should I sit on his left side or right? Was that sound a happy sound or an anxious sound? Once he asked how to apologize to a 6-year-old who might not understand all the words, and I told him children understand tone before language. So start there. That evening, he sat on the rug near Jonah, not too close, and said, "I scared you. I am sorry. I am learning." Jonah did not answer, but he rolled the red ball toward him. Adrian stared at it like it was a royal decree. Then he rolled it back. Mrs. Whitmore watched from the hall with tears in her eyes, and I pretended to dust a shelf for 7 minutes because apparently emotional privacy in that house depended on me cleaning already clean things. The real turning point came during a storm. Boston storms in late March have a nasty personality. Cold rain, mean wind, the kind that rattles old windows and makes rich neighborhoods look just as helpless as everybody else's. The power went out around dinner. 1 second the house was glowing with all its expensive hidden lighting, and the next it dropped into darkness. So complete, Jonah screamed, not cried, screamed. The sound tore through the house and sent Adrian sprinting from the kitchen. I was closer, so I got to Jonah first, but I did not grab him. I knelt near the sofa where he had folded himself into a corner, hands over his ears, body shaking. "It is dark," I said, keeping my voice low. "That is scary. We are here. No one is leaving." Adrian came in with a flashlight, beam jerking wildly across the walls. Jonah screamed harder. Adrian froze, panic rising fast. "Turn it down," I said. He fumbled with it, hands shaking, and bounced the light toward the ceiling instead. "Mr. Zend." Whitmore brought candles from a drawer, her old hands steady because grandmothers can be battlefield nurses when they need to be. The room filled with soft gold light, shadows trembling over the walls, and slowly Jonah's screams broke into sobs. Adrian sat on the floor across from him, breathing like he had run miles. I could see the war in him, the urge to rush forward, the discipline to stay still. I began humming, barely above the rain. Not a lullaby exactly, just an old tune my mother used to hum when our apartment pipes clanged at night. Jonah's sobs softened. Adrian looked at me and I thought he might object out of habit, but he did not. Instead, after a moment, he hummed too. Badly, very badly. Off-key in a way that might have violated local ordinances. Jonah lifted his head. Mrs. Whitmore made a sound somewhere between crying and laughing. I whispered, "Mr. Whitmore, with all due respect, that note needs medical attention." Adrian gave me a look through the candlelight, but for the first time, he did not shut the moment down. He adjusted, still bad, but softer. Jonah's hands lowered from his ears. The fox was clutched against his chest. The rain hammered the glass. Thunder rolled over the roof, and there we were, the millionaire, the grandmother, the housekeeper, and the silent boy, sitting on the floor in a house that had finally lost power in more ways than one. After a while, Jonah crawled one small inch toward Adrian. Nobody moved. Then another inch. Adrian's face crumpled, but he stayed still. Jonah stopped halfway, exhausted, then reached out and placed the fox on the floor between them. It was not a hug. It was not forgiveness wrapped in a bow. It was better. It was trust offered from a distance. Adrian touched the fox with 2 fingers and whispered, "Thank you." Jonah looked at him. His lips moved. "Dia." 1 syllable. Barely there. But Adrian heard it. I heard it. Mrs. Whitmore heard it and sat down hard in a chair like her knees had resigned. Adrian covered his mouth with one hand, eyes shining in the candlelight, and whispered, "I am here, buddy. I am here, buddy." The power stayed out for almost 2 hours. During that time, Adrian told the truth. Maybe darkness made it easier. Maybe Jonah's little Dow had broken the last lock. He spoke about the accident again, this time with Jonah in the room, not in graphic detail, not burdening him, but gently naming what everyone had been afraid to name. "Mommy loved you," he said, voice shaking. "And I miss her too. I got scared. I got so scared. I got so scared I forgot how to make this house feel safe. I am sorry." Jonah leaned against the sofa, eyes heavy, listening or not. It was hard to tell, but I believe children feel honesty even when they cannot hold all the words. I sat beside Mrs. Whitmore and she took my hand. Her palm was thin and warm. Adrian looked at me across the candlelight, and the expression on his face was not gratitude exactly. Not yet, but recognition. Like he understood I had not come into his house to save anyone. I had come to survive, and somehow survival had turned into witness. The next morning, everything looked washed clean. Rain streaked the windows, the garden shone dark green, and the house smelled like toast because Adrian had decided to make breakfast himself, which meant the smoke alarm got involved, and Mrs. Whitmore used language I will not repeat out of respect for her pearls. Jonah sat at the table, sleepy but calm, and when Adrian placed a slightly burned piece of toast in front of him, Jonah looked at it, then at me, then whispered, "Ow, I lost it." I laughed so hard I had to turn around. Adrian looked offended for about 1 second. then laughed too, and that was the first time I heard that house sound like a home. But progress has a way of showing you how far you still have to go. Jonah could make sounds now, a few words on good days, but his body was still locked in fear. He could sit, reach, lean, sometimes pull himself up with help, but walking terrified him. The therapist worked gently, but the house itself carried too many memories. Every corner had history, but the house itself carried too many memories. Every polished floor seemed to ask him to fall. One afternoon, after he tried standing and broke down trembling, I found Adrian in the garden, coat collar up, staring at the wet brick wall. I had been researching at night, reading about trauma recovery, movement therapy, animal-assisted therapy, music sensory integration, anything that might help a child whose nervous system had turned the whole world into a warning. I had found a small pediatric rehabilitation center in western Massachusetts, near the Berkshires, a converted farm with therapy dogs, music rooms, warm water pools, and specialists who worked with children after traumatic loss. It was not magic. I knew better than to trust magic. But it was different, softer, less like a clinic, more like a place where a child could remember his body without feeling watched by ghosts. I told Adrian about it in the garden. He did not answer at first. The old Adrian would have dismissed it before I finished the sentence. Too experimental, too disruptive, too emotional, too much like hope. The new Adrian just stood there, listening to the rain drip from the ivy. Finally, he said, "What if it fails?" I wanted to give him something comforting, but he had earned honesty. "Then it fails," I said, "and we come home knowing we tried something that was not fear." He looked at me, and his eyes were tired but open. "We asked." I felt the word before I understood it. We. Not employer and employee, not rich man and housekeeper, not father and outsider. Just we, the people Jonah had somehow gathered around him by daring to whisper blue. I looked back toward the window where Jonah sat with Mrs. Whitmore and Senator Waffles, the fox tucked under one arm, his little face turned toward us. "Yes," I said. "We." Adrian nodded slowly, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, hovered over the screen. For a moment I could see the fear come back. Not gone, maybe never gone, but no longer driving alone. He looked at me and said, "Give me the name of the center." I gave it to him. He called before he could change his mind. 3 days later, after more forms, consultations, packing lists, and one extremely serious household debate about whether Senator Waffles counted as a therapeutic support object, we were ready to leave for the Berkshires. Jonah did not understand the whole plan, but he understood we were going somewhere together. Adrian knelt by him in the foyer, holding out 2 choices, the fox in one hand and Senator Waffles in the other. Jonah looked from one to the other, then took both, because apparently healing had made him ambitious. Mrs. Whitmore laughed. I zipped Jonah's little jacket while Adrian watched, not hovering, just present. Outside, the car waited at the curb, black and polished, but for once it did not feel like it belonged to another world. It felt like a bridge. As we stepped out into the cold morning, Jonah's hand found mine first, small fingers curling around 2 of mine, and then, after a pause, his other hand reached for Adrian. Adrian looked down at that tiny hand like it was the first sunrise he had ever seen. He took it carefully, almost reverently, and together we walked toward the car. Slow, uneven, all of us afraid in our own ways, all of us going anyway. The road out to the Berkshires looked nothing like Beacon Hill, and maybe that was the first mercy of it, because the farther we drove from that glass house with its polished floors and careful silence, the more Jonah seemed to loosen by tiny degrees. Not enough for anyone else to notice, maybe, but enough for me. His fingers still held mine, still held Adrian's, but he was not clutching anymore. And when the city thinned into old mill towns, bare trees, stone walls, little farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys, he turned his face toward the window, as if the world had quietly become interesting again. Adrian sat beside him in the back seat, which he insisted was practical, not emotional. And I did not argue, because I had learned that some men need to pretend tenderness is logistics before they can survive it. Mrs. Whitmore rode in front with the driver and kept offering snacks nobody asked for, crackers, apple slices, little wrapped mints from the bottom of her purse, and at one point she handed me a hard candy that looked older than my high school diploma. I took it anyway. Family trips have traditions, and apparently ours began with Auntie Butterscotch. The center was called Willow Creek House, though it was not a hospital in the way I expected. It sat on 50 acres of rolling fields outside a small town where the sidewalks were brick. The coffee shop had one chalkboard menu, and everybody looked like they owned at least 2 sweaters for emotional reasons. Willow Creek itself was an old white farmhouse connected to a newer therapy wing with big windows, warm wooden floors, low shelves, therapy mats, music rooms, and doors that opened straight out toward a fenced pasture where two golden retrievers, a sleepy pony, and one deeply judgmental goat stood around like they were on staff. Jonah saw the dogs first. His hand tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. Adrian leaned down and said, "We can just look today. No pressure." That sentence, coming from him, felt like watching a statue learn to breathe. A therapist named Marcy met us at the front door. Short, curly-haired, bright-eyed, wearing sneakers with little suns drawn on them, and she spoke to Jonah the way I had always wished adults would speak to. Frightened children, not loud, not sugary, not trying too hard. "Hi, Jonah," she said. "I am Marcy, and these are my shoes. They make terrible fashion choices, but excellent therapy decisions." Jonah stared at her shoes. Adrian looked confused. Mrs. Whitmore smiled immediately. I decided I trusted Marcy. She told us the first day was not about progress. It was about safety. And if safety meant Jonah sat in a corner holding his fox, while everyone else pretended not to watch him, then that would be our work. Adrian nodded, but I could see him fighting the old panic, the rich man's reflex to measure, compare, demand results. Because money teaches people to believe every problem should come with a receipt and a timeline. Marcy must have seen it too, because she said gently, "Mr. Whitmore, healing is not a staircase. It is more like weather. You can prepare for it, but you cannot order it around." Adrian glanced at me, probably because he knew I was storing that sentence for later use. I was. The first session was nothing dramatic. Jonah sat on a blue mat near the wall, Fox in his lap, Senator Waffles tucked under my elbow because apparently I had become the personal assistant to a sock. Marcy rolled a soft ball back and forth with me, not to Jonah, just near him, letting him watch movement without being pulled into it. In the corner, one golden retriever named Maple slept with her belly up in a way that showed a scandalous lack of professionalism. Adrian sat behind Jonah, farther than he wanted, closer than he used to allow. His hands clasped so tight his knuckles went white. Every few minutes he looked like he might speak, and every time he swallowed it. I know that sounds small, but in Adrian's world, not interrupting was practically a spiritual retreat. After 20 minutes, Jonah reached out and touched the ball with 2 fingers. That was it. 2 fingers. The kind of thing most people would miss, the kind of thing no newspaper would write about. But Adrian covered his mouth. Mrs. Whitmore cried into another napkin, and Marcy said softly, "There you are. Not good job. Not amazing. Not come on. Just there you are." Like Jonah had opened the little door and she had been waiting politely outside. The next few days moved like that, slow, tender, frustrating, hopeful, sometimes all in the same hour. Jonah liked the music room, but only when the guitar was soft. He hated the drum at first, until Marcy let him tap it once with the fox's paw, and then it became acceptable because apparently trauma recovery has room for stuffed animal percussion. He would not go near the pony, which I understood, because the pony had the emotional confidence of a landlord, but he watched Maple the golden retriever from across the room, and Maple watched him back with the wise patience of a creature who had never paid rent and therefore still believed in peace. Adrian struggled more than he wanted to admit. The first time Jonah cried during a movement exercise, Adrian stood so fast his chair scraped the floor, and Jonah startled, folding inward. Marcy put one hand up, calm but firm. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." He froze. I saw the fight in him. The old Adrian would have reminded her who was paying for the center, who had the final say, who could summon experts with one phone call. But this Adrian looked at Jonah, saw the fear rising, and sat back down like every inch of that movement hurt. Later outside, near the pasture fence, he said to me, "I hate this." I said, "I know." He looked over, jaw tight. "No, Clara, I mean I hate watching him hurt and doing nothing." "You are not doing nothing," I said. "You are not turning your fear into his instructions. That is a lot." He leaned on the fence. The goat stared at him with open contempt. Adrian stared back. "Does that animal dislike me?" I said. "The goat has boundaries." He almost smiled. Then he said, "What if he never walks again?" The question came out so quietly I knew it had been living in him for months. I could have said he will. I could have lied kindly, but hope built on lies falls apart when people need it most. So I said, "Then he will still be Jonah, and we will love him in whatever body he trusts." Adrian looked at me for a long time, and that was one of the first times I saw him accept that loving his son could not be conditional on a miracle. But miracles, when they came sideways. On the 5th day, Jonah sat on the mat with Maple lying near his feet, not touching, just close enough to be warm. Marcy had set a line of colorful beanbags just out of reach, and she asked him if he wanted to help Maple choose one. Jonah did not move. We waited. The whole room waited without looking like it was waiting, which is an art form. Then Maple sighed, a big dramatic dog sigh, like she'd been working doubles, and Jonah looked at her. His mouth twitched. I whispered, "That dog has unpaid bills." Jonah made a breathy sound. Adrian shot me a look that said, "Do not ruin this, and thank you at the same time." Jonah leaned forward, palm flat on the mat, and pushed one beanbag toward Maple. It was yellow. Maple sniffed it, then rested her chin on it like she had received an award. Jonah made the sound again, but this time it was closer to a laugh. Adrian's eyes filled, and he did not turn away fast enough to hide it. Mrs. Whitmore squeezed shoulder. He let her. That mattered too. Every wall in that family came down by inches, and some of those inches had nothing to do with Jonah's legs. At night we stayed in a little guest cottage on the property. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a pull-out sofa, a kitchenette, a fireplace that smoked if you looked at it wrong. Mrs. Whitmore took the smaller bedroom because she said old women require less space and more blankets. Adrian insisted I take the other room because I was there working, and I told him that if he said that in a way that made me feel like staff again, I would make Senator Waffles file a labor complaint. He apologized, badly, but he did, so I took the room. Adrian slept on the pull-out sofa and acted like the springs were not rearranging his spine every night. On the second evening after Jonah fell asleep with the fox tucked under one arm and Maple's borrowed bandana under the other, I found Adrian in the kitchen trying to make tea. I say trying because the man had built hotels and managed investments but could not locate a kettle sitting directly in front of him. I helped him before the cabinets filed a missing persons report. We sat at the small table with Mubs between us, and for once, there was no mansion around us to define who we were. No staff room, no marble hall, no study door, just 2 tired adults listening to a child breathe in the next room. Adrian said, "Meredith would have liked you." I did not know what to do with that. Compliments from him still arrived like furniture delivered to the wrong address. I said, "She sounds like she had good taste and poor judgment, considering she married you." He laughed softly, then looked down into his tea. "She used to tell me I wanted life to behave because I was scared of how much I loved it." "That woman knew you." "Yes," he said, "she did." His voice went thin at the edges. "I miss being known like that." I looked at him then, really looked, and I felt something shift that I had been trying not to name. Gratitude had become trust. Trust had become friendship. And friendship, if you did not keep an eye on it, could become something dangerous in a room lit by a cheap lamp while rain tapped on a farmhouse roof. I reminded myself of every reason not to step any closer. He was my employer. He was grieving. I was broke. He was complicated enough to require a user manual. But the heart is not a courtroom. It does not wait for all the paperwork to be clean before entering evidence. I said, being known is scary too. Once people know where you are, soft, they know where to hurt you. Adrian nodded, or where to hold you. Neither of us said anything after that. We just sat with the sentence between us, warm and frightening, while the old cottage settled around us. By the 8th day, Jonah was stronger. Not walking, not yet, but reaching more, sitting taller, letting Maple's fur brush his ankle without flinching, pressing piano keys in the music room one at a time, with Marcy beside him. His words were still few. Blue, fox, da, ow, which he used often and not always accurately. He called Mrs. Whitmore Nana once, and she had to leave the room because Joy had made her unpresentable. He had not called my anything. I told myself that was fine, because it was fine. I was paying him because I was the housekeeper, the caretaker, the woman who cut blueberries into questionable shapes. I was not his mother. I knew that. But love is not always polite enough to stay inside the title you give it. One morning, we went to the warm water therapy pool, a shallow room filled with soft light and the echo of small splashes. Jonah was nervous. Water had been part of the accident story. Not deep water, but rain, ice, flashing lights on wet pavement, enough for his body to remember danger where his mind could not explain it. Adrian carried him to the pool steps, slow and careful, and for a second, Jonah's face tightened. The old Adrian would have said, "You're okay, buddy, you're okay," as if saying it could make it true. This Adrian stopped and asked, "Do you want to wait?" Jonah looked at the water, then at Adrian, then at me. I was standing ankle-deep with Marcy, holding a floating toy boat. Senator Waffles, unfortunately, had been banned from the pool due to being a sock and having no lifeguard certification. I said, "We can wait all day. I brought snacks." Marcy said, "She did." I saw them. Jonah stared at us and then, very slowly, he leaned toward Adrian's chest, not away from the water but toward Trust. Adrian stepped down into the pool with him. One step, then another. Jonah whimpered but did not scream. Adrian's face was pale with concentration. I began humming softly, not because humming fixed anything, but because steady sound had become a rope we could all hold. Marcy guided Jonah's legs in the warm water, letting the buoyancy take some of the fear, and after several minutes Jonah's toes pressed against the pool floor. He looked startled, almost offended, as if his own feet had gone behind his back and joined a new organization. Adrian laughed under his breath, crying at the same time. "That is it, buddy," he whispered. "You are standing. Not alone, not fully, but standing." Jonah looked at him, then down at the water, then at me. His lips moved. "Caw." My body went still. He tried again. "Kawa. Clara," I whispered before I could stop myself. He blinked. "Kawa. Clara," I whispered before I could stop myself. He blinked. "Ka." I smiled so hard it hurt. "Close enough, sweetheart. I have been called worse before breakfast." Adrian looked at me, and the emotion on his face was almost too much to carry, because it was not jealousy, not discomfort, not even surprise. It was gratitude so deep it humbled both of us. The final breakthrough came on the 10th afternoon, when the light outside turned golden, and the light outside turned golden, and the whole farm seemed to hold its breath. I know stories like this make people suspicious because they sound too neat, too polished, too movie ending, but real life does sometimes choose good lighting just to mess with your cynicism. We were in the movement room, the one with wide windows facing the pasture. Maple lay by the door. Mrs. Whitmore sat in a chair knitting something that had started as a scarf and was becoming, through sheer lack of planning, possibly a blanket for a very narrow person. Adrian sat on the mat with Jonah, and I was a few feet away holding the red ball. Marcy had placed a low wooden rail between us, something Jonah could pull up on if he chose, and the plan was simple. No pressure, no finish line, just practice shifting weight. Jonah had been in a bright mood all morning. He had eaten toast that was only lightly criminal, laughed when the goat sneezed, and pressed 2 piano keys at once, which Marcy called harmony and I called aggressive jazz. He reached for the rail. Adrian held his breath. I saw him catch himself and exhale slowly. Jonah gripped the rail with both hands and pulled. His knees shook. His little body trembled with effort. Halfway up, fear crossed his face like a cloud. Adrian whispered, "I am right here." I added, "And Maple is supervising, so nobody embarrass us." Jonah made a tiny sound that might have been irritation, which honestly felt like progress. Then he stood. Fully stood. His legs wobbled. His hands clung to the rail. His face went pale, but he was standing in the golden light with his fox tucked under one arm and every adult in the room trying not to burst apart. Marcy's voice stayed soft. "Beautiful, Jonah. You can sit whenever you want." But he did not sit. He looked at the red ball in my hands. I placed it on the floor between us, just a little distance away. Not far. Not enough to force. Enough to invite. Jonah looked at Adrian. Adrian nodded, tears already slipping down his face. Jonah let go with one hand. Mrs. Whitmore stopped knitting mid-stitch. Maple lifted her head. The goat outside, I swear to you, appeared in the window like even he had heard the news. Jonah released the rail with his other hand. For half a second, he stood alone. Then he took one step. His foot landed awkward, small, uncertain. He almost tipped. Adrian's whole body jerked. Small, uncertain. He almost tipped. Adrian's whole body jerked, but he did not grab him. He trusted him. Then another. 3 little steps across a therapy room floor. 3 steps that weighed more than every marble slab in that Beacon Hill house. 3 steps out of silence, out of fear, out of the night that had stolen his mother and tracked his father. He reached the ball, touched it, then looked up at me with his eyes bright and wide. I knelt because my legs had forgotten their job. Jonah's mouth opened. For a moment, nothing came out. Then he said, "Clara." Small, perfect. My heart broke in the best way. "Yes, baby," I whispered. "I am here." Then he turned, wobbling, and Adrian was already on his knees with both hands open, not reaching first, not taking, just offering. Jonah took 2 more stumbling steps and fell into his father's arms. Adrian caught him like he was receiving the whole world back. Jonah pressed his face into Adrian's shoulder and said, "Daddy." Not "da," not a breath. "Daddy." Adrian made a sound I will never forget. Half sob, half laugh, the sound of a man being forgiven by someone too young to understand the size of the forgiveness he was giving. Mrs. Whitmore covered her face. Marcy cried openly. Professional boundaries apparently taking the afternoon off. I sat on the floor with one hand over my mouth while Jonah lifted his head from Adrian's shoulder, looked back at me, and reached turned with him, and I moved closer. Jonah put one hand on my cheek, warm and damp from tears, and said something that made the whole room go still. Mama. Now, before anyone starts arguing with the screen, let me say this clearly. I did not teach him that. I did not ask for it. I did not even know I wanted it, until the word landed in my chest and knocked the air out of me. I looked at Adrian, terrified for half a second that the word would hurt him, that it would reopen everything, that Meredith's memory would rise between us like a wall. But Adrian only cried harder, and he nodded once, a broken, beautiful nod, as if he understood love had not replaced what was lost. It had grown beside it. I held Jonah carefully, and he leaned into me without fear. Not because I was his real mother. Meredith would always be his mother. But because children know the shape of safety before adults find language for it. In that room, under that golden afternoon light, Jonah walked, Adrian let go. Mrs. Whitmore stopped apologizing to ghosts, and I realized I had spent months trying to save my family by earning money, only to stumble into another family that needed saving in a way no money could touch. We stayed at Willow Creek 2 more weeks. Progress did not become perfect after that day, because life is not cruel enough to be that simple. Jonah still had bad mornings. He still froze when sounds were too sharp. Sometimes he woke crying for a mother whose voice lived somewhere beyond memory. Adrian still had moments when fear climbed into the driver's seat and grabbed the wheel. I still worried about bills, about my mother, about Lila, about what would happen when we returned to a world where labels mattered again. But something fundamental had changed. Fear no longer made every decision. Love got a vote. When we returned to Beacon Hill, the house looked the same from the outside. Iron gate, ivy wall, glass and limestone shining under a pale spring sky. But inside it had become almost unrecognizable. Adrian ordered half the formal furniture removed from the main living room and replaced it with things a child could climb on, spill near, and survive. Mrs. Whitmore framed Jonah's drawings and hung them crooked on purpose, because she said perfection had been evicted. The grand piano, once silent and accusing, became a place for Jonah to press keys while Adrian made up terrible songs about toast, goats, and the political career of Senator Waffles. I kept working there, but the word employee no longer fit cleanly. Adrian tried to raise my salary again, and I told him yes this time, because growth is important and so is paying medical bills. He also arranged for my mother to see a specialist, not as charity, he said quickly, but as part of a family health plan. I told him that explanation was nonsense, but appreciated nonsense. Lila visited one weekend and immediately bonded with Mrs. Whitmore over crossword puzzles in the mutual belief that Adrian needed to be humbled regularly. My mother came the next month, frail but smiling, and when she met Jonah, he handed her the fox without being asked. Mama cried in the car afterward and said, "Clara May, you found a house that was starving and fed it with your stubborn heart." I told her that sounded like something people put on decorative pillows. She said maybe, but it is still true. As for Adrian and me, people always want to know when it became love, like there was one clean moment where the music started and we both knew. It was not like that. It was built in small repairs. It was in the way he learned my mother's medication schedule, without making a show of it. The way he asked about Lila's exams. The way he started leaving coffee for me in the morning and pretending he had made too much by accident. It was in the way I called him out when he drifted back toward control, and the way he actually listened instead of punishing me for being right. It was in the first time he said, "I am scared," without turning it into an order. It was in the quiet evenings after Jonah slept, when we sat in the kitchen of that once frozen house, talking about Meredith, my father, grief, money, class, guilt, family, and all the strange ways people survive what should have ended them. We did not rush it. We could not. There was too much at stake, too many wounds, too many reasons to be careful. But love, real love, does not always arrive like lightning. Sometimes it arrives like someone staying in the room after the hard truth has been spoken. A year later, Adrian sold the glass house. People in a circle acted as if he had announced he was moving into a tree. "Why would you sell a historic Beacon Hill property?" they asked. Adrian said, "Because my son learned to laugh somewhere else." We bought a white farmhouse not far from Willow Creek, with a porch that sagged slightly on the left, a kitchen big enough for too many opinions, and a yard where Jonah could run in uneven, joyful circles until he collapsed laughing in the grass. Mrs. Whitmore moved into the guest cottage and called it her retirement palace, though she spent most days in our kitchen correcting everyone. Lila came during school breaks. Mama's health improved enough for her to sit on the porch in the afternoons wrapped in a blanket, telling Jonah stories about my father that made him giggle. And on a Saturday in late May, with lilacs blooming along the fence and Jonah wearing a crooked bow tie he had chosen himself, Adrian asked me to marry him under the old maple tree behind the house. He did not make a big speech. That would not have been us. He took my hands, looked at me with those eyes that were no longer cold, only honest, and said, "You walked into my house when it was full of ghosts, and you taught us how to live with the windows open. I love you, Clara May Turner. Will you build the rest of this life with us?" Jonah stood beside him holding the ring box upside down, because romance is Whitmore. Turn it over, darling, like she was coaching national security. I laughed and cried at the same time, which is not attractive, but very sincere, and I said yes. Not because Adrian was rich, not because the story needed a neat ending. I said yes because the man in front of me had done the hardest thing I had ever seen a proud person do. He had changed, he had faced the truth, apologized without buying his way out of it, learned to love without locking everything down, and chosen to become softer in a world that had punished him for being helpless. That is not a small thing. These days, Jonah still has the fox. Senator Waffles lives on a shelf in the kitchen like a retired statesman. Maple visits from Willow Creek whenever Marcy brings her by, and the goat, may he continue judging from a distance, remains my personal reminder that not everyone needs to like you for you to be doing something right. Jonah runs now, not always gracefully, but with joy, and every time his feet hit the porch steps, Adrian looks up. He is hearing music. Sometimes grief still comes by. It sits at the table with us on Meredith's birthday, on my father's birthday, on rainy nights when old memories press against the windows. But it no longer owns the house. We make room for it. Then we pass the bread, tell a bad joke, spill something, clean it up badly, and keep living. And maybe that is the part people miss when they talk about miracles. The miracle was not just that Jonah walked. It was not even that he spoke. The miracle was that a house full of frightened people finally stopped treating love like a threat. A poor woman came there needing a paycheck. A rich man stood there needing forgiveness. A little boy sat between them needing safety. And somehow, through blueberries, bad puppets, burned toast, hard truth, and more patience than any of us thought we had, we found our way back to each other. So now, I want to ask you this, and I really mean it. Was Adrian wrong for trying to control everything after losing his wife? Or was he just a broken father doing the only thing he knew how to do? Did Clara cross the line as an employee? Or was she the only person brave enough to tell the truth in a house where money had made everyone too polite to say it? And when a child calls someone mama, not by blood but by trust, who gets to decide what family really means? Tell me what you think in the comments, because stories like this are not just about rich families and poor housekeepers. They're about grief, power, forgiveness, and the kind of love that makes people uncomfortable because it refuses to stay in the boxes society gives it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes people can change. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with us for the next story, because sometimes justice is loud. Sometimes it comes in courtrooms. Sometimes it comes through revenge. But sometimes, just sometimes, justice sounds like a little boy laughing in a house that finally feels like home.